An elderly woman rescues bear cubs when the grizzly returns. No one expects what follows. The wind had begun its haunting song before nightfall, a low, rising howl that curled through the pine trees and wrapped itself around the cabin like a warning. Inside, Margaret Holloway moved with slow precision, feeding the fire one log at a time, checking the pantry, counting the remaining jars of canned soup, and boiling water for tea. Outside, snow fell in thick sheets, swallowing the path to the woodshed and erasing all signs of Henry's footprints. He had left 2 days ago with his old rifle and his orange hunting cap pulled down tight, promising to be back before the storm hit. "It'll just brush the edge of Holloway Ridge," he'd said. The kind of confident guess only someone who'd lived in the mountains too long could make. Margaret hadn't argued, she rarely did. The woods had taught her long ago that arguing with nature, or with stubborn men, was like shouting into the wind. She'd simply nodded and watched him vanish into the trees. Now, 2 days later, there was no sign of Henry, and the storm was no longer a rumor. It roared like a beast unleashed, battering the roof and shutters with a fury that made the old cabin tremble at its joints. Margaret sat near the hearth, sipping weak chamomile tea, her fingers curled around the mug, not for the drink, but for its warmth. Her bones ached more with each winter, and tonight they felt brittle, like twigs underfoot. The power had been out since morning, not that she relied on it much. The old generator in the shed was frozen solid. She had candles, oil lamps, wood, and blankets. She would survive, she always did. Still, something gnawed at her, not just the silence, which she had grown to welcome in her solitude, but the absence of a sound she hadn't realized she counted on, Henry's whistling as he walked back from the ridge, the crunch of his boots on snow. She had known him for nearly 30 years, not friends exactly, not lovers, just nearby, a presence. The kind of neighbor who never asked questions but always brought extra eggs if his hens laid well. Margaret had chosen this life after everything fell apart, after the fire, after losing her family, after the city swallowed her grief with its noise. Here, in the stillness of Holloway Ridge, she'd begun to breathe again. She wasn't ready to lose another thread of connection, however thin it had become. The wind paused just for a breath, and in that rare hush, Margaret heard it, a sound that didn't belong, low, guttural, and too deliberate to be the creak of trees. She set down her mug and stood slowly, every joint resisting. Slipping on her heavy coat, scarf, and boots, she grabbed the lantern by the door and lit it with practiced fingers. The flame flickered weakly but held. She opened the door and stepped into the white. Her breath caught in a gasp as the cold bit through everything. The sound came again, closer now, a kind of strangled growl, muffled by snow and wind. Margaret followed it past the frozen porch into the trees, where the drifts reached her knees. The lantern swung with each step, casting golden light on bent pine branches and ghostly snowbanks. Then she saw it. At the base of a pine, half buried in snow and blood, lay a bear, massive, panting, her chest heaving with effort. One leg was trapped in a steel jaw device, the kind Margaret hadn't seen in decades, illegal now, but some men still set them deep in the woods, hoping to catch something worth skinning. The bear's fur was slick with red, her breath shallow. Her eyes found Margaret, not in rage but in something closer to pain or resignation. And beside her, 3 small shapes trembling and huddled together, eyes wide with fear. Cubs? Margaret froze. Every instinct told her to back away slowly to avoid the wrath of a wounded mother, but the bear didn't growl again. She just looked, unmoving, and the cubs, no bigger than shepherd dogs, whimpered softly, pressing into each other for warmth. Margaret knelt, ignoring the wet cold seeping into her pants. The bear's leg was ruined, muscle and bone crushed by the trap. There was no saving her, no dragging her back, no way to free her that wouldn't cause more agony. She didn't cry out as Margaret inspected the injury, only flinched slightly, then settled again with a deep exhale. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered, her breath a ghost between them. She stood and, from her coat pocket, pulled a revolver, an old, clean piece she hadn't used in years, reserved only for wolves or worse. She looked at the cubs, then back at the mother. "I won't let you suffer." One shot. The forest went silent again. The cubs cried out, stumbling back. Margaret dropped the gun into the snow and pressed her gloved hands to her eyes. When she could breathe again, she moved forward, gathering the cubs one by one. They were light, frightened, claws scraping her coat, but they didn't bite. Their warmth bled into her chest as she bundled them close. She walked back through the storm with her arms full, leaving the mother behind in a grave of snow and steel. Inside the cabin, she laid them on a thick wool blanket near the hearth. They curled into each other immediately, still shaking. Margaret moved quickly, setting a pot of milk to warm, crushing an old tin of dog biscuits into powder. She remembered caring for orphaned animals on her father's farm, calves, raccoons, even a fox once. She found the old rubber-tipped baby bottles in the cupboard, still clean. The first cub resisted but drank eventually. The others followed. The fire crackled louder, fighting the cold that had snuck in with them. The snowstorm outside roared on, but in here, something was happening, something Margaret hadn't felt in years. She sat in the rocking chair beside the fire, 3 cubs sleeping at her feet, her hands wrapped around a new cup of tea. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. The wind began to ease by morning, but the world remained locked in silence, blanketed in a deep and undisturbed white. Margaret Holloway awoke in her chair, her neck stiff and her back sore. The fire reduced to glowing embers. Her first thought wasn't of Henry or the snow outside, but of the small lives sleeping beneath her faded wool blanket. She leaned forward slowly, and there they were, 3 tiny bears, curled together like fallen leaves, their chests rising and falling in gentle rhythm. Their fur now dry, their small bodies warmer than they'd been in days. For a long moment, she simply watched them, something short and unfamiliar blooming in her chest. The grief she'd carried for so long had always been cold and dense, like a stone at the bottom of a lake, but this was warmth rising up through the cracks. Carefully, she stood, stirring the fire back to life, then slipped into the kitchen. She warmed more goat's milk and crushed the last of her dog biscuits, setting the mixture into the bottles with clumsy but steady hands. They would need more food soon, real food, but she'd figure that out later. For now, she could give them this. The cubs stirred when she knelt beside them. Cedar, first, his small face bowed and nose twitching at the scent. He scrambled over his siblings, nudging the bottle eagerly. Birch followed, cautious but hungry. Juniper took longer, blinking up at her with sleepy confusion before she finally accepted the milk. Margaret whispered their names aloud, unsure where they'd come from, only that they fit: Cedar, the brave one; Birch, the curious; Juniper, the soft soul. She spoke to them gently, telling them stories of the ridge, of how their mother had been fierce and brave, and how the forest, cruel though it could be, was still full of wonders they didn't understand, of course, but they listened in their own way. The day passed like a strange dream, the outside world lost behind thick layers of snow and frost. Margaret moved about the cabin with purpose, retrieving old towels, cleaning up a few paw-shaped messes, checking her stores. There wasn't much left, certainly not enough to keep 3 cubs fed for long, but she pushed the worry down deep. One day at a time. That was how she'd lived for years. It would be enough. Now, the snowstorm left behind a quiet too deep to ignore. The cabin walls creaked. Somewhere in the woods, trees cracked under the weight of ice. Margaret opened the door only once, stepping onto the porch to breathe in the cold air, and looked toward the ridge, nothing but white. No tracks. No sign of Henry. She held the edge of the doorway for balance, her heart twisting in her chest. "Damn fool," she muttered, her voice rough. She stood there for another minute, scanning the stillness, hoping, but there was no movement, just wind. It was 2 days later when the knock came. It was hard, sharp, urgent. Margaret was in the kitchen rinsing out the bottles when she heard it. Her first instinct was fear. No one knocked on her door, not in the middle of winter, not way out here. She grabbed the rifle from behind the doorframe. It wasn't loaded, but it was heavy and convincing. She cracked the door, and there he stood, Thomas Grady, tall, broad-shouldered, and slick with snow. His coat looked newer than the man inside it, and his eyes held the same predatory gleam they always had. He smiled, the kind of smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Morning, Miss Holloway," he said, his voice syrupy. "Hell of a storm. Thought I'd check in on you." Margaret didn't move. "No one checks on me, Grady." "What do you want?" His smile tightened. "Saw bear tracks near the old creek bed. Real fresh. Thought maybe you'd seen something. Heard one of the mother bears might have gotten herself caught." Margaret didn't answer. Her grip on the door didn't loosen. Grady tilted his head, trying to peer past her into the cabin. "Mighty warm in there. Smells like milk." Margaret's heart thudded once, hard. "Go home, Grady," she said, but he stepped forward. "You wouldn't happen to be harboring wildlife, would you?" "That's a federal offense, you know," he said casually, like asking about the weather. Before she could reply, a sound broke the tension, a low growl, long and deep, from somewhere beyond the cabin. Grady froze. Margaret blinked. She hadn't heard it at first, hadn't even registered it above her pulse, but now it was unmistakable. She turned her head just slightly and followed Grady's gaze, past the porch and across the snowy clearing. There, emerging from between 2 thick pines, stood a grizzly. Not just any grizzly, a giant, towering beast with thick brown fur, wide shoulders, and black unreadable eyes. He didn't move fast. He didn't charge. He simply walked forward with slow, deliberate confidence, the snow crunching beneath his weight, the air around him silent with reverence. Margaret had never seen him before, but something about him felt old, ancient, even, like the forest had carved him from its heartwood and sent him here for a reason. Grady stepped back, his hand moving toward the hunting knife on his belt. The bear paused 10 feet from the porch and let out another sound, not a roar, not a scream, but something primal and warning. Grady froze. Margaret could see the calculation behind his eyes. He wasn't afraid of much, but this was something different. This was the wild looking back at him with no fear. "You brought him here, didn't you?" Grady hissed. Margaret said nothing. The bear took a single step closer. Grady backed away quickly now, slipping in the snow, cursing under his breath. "This isn't over," he spat before turning and stumbling into the trees. The bear didn't follow. He stood there for a few more moments, watching the retreating figure, then slowly turned and disappeared into the woods like smoke. Margaret stood still, her hands trembling. She exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding and finally closed the door. Inside, the cubs stirred again, sensing something, perhaps remembering a scent. Margaret knelt beside them, pressing her hands to their small backs. "Your father," she whispered, "your guardian?" She didn't know, not really, but she did know this: the wild had seen fit to send her 3 cubs and a bear to guard them. And somehow, in that strange, sacred arrangement, she was not alone. Margaret woke to the sound of scratching, soft and rhythmic, just beneath the windowsill. She rose slowly, her knees stiff, and approached the frost-covered glass. Outside, the sky was still dark, a hazy lavender, as dawn threatened to arrive. Beneath the sill, 3 small noses poked out from the snow, followed by curious black eyes. The cubs had found a way out through a loose board by the fireplace and had wandered into the cold before realizing they missed the fire. She sighed, pushed the door open, and stepped into the brittle morning air. "You lot are going to be the death of me," she muttered, gathering them up one by one. Cedar resisted, pawing at the snow with a stubborn growl. Birch climbed onto her boot as if it were a log. Juniper shivered violently and pressed into her side. She brought them in, set them down before the fire, and refastened the plank. They were growing stronger, that much was clear. Cedar's steps were bolder, Birch's eyes more alert, and even Juniper, though still timid, had begun to explore the cabin in tentative loops. But it also meant they would need more food. Her stores had nearly vanished. There were a few more cans of beans, some hardtack, and a bag of oats. No meat, no milk, and the goats hadn't been milked in 3 days because of the storm. They would be weak now, too. By mid-morning, the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting brilliant spears of gold across the icy trees. Margaret bundled herself in layers, armed herself with the old sled, and made her way down the slope to the goat shed. The path was treacherous, coated in black ice beneath the snow. She walked carefully, the sled rope wrapped around her wrist. Inside the shed, she found the goats huddled, bleating softly. Alive, but hungry and cold. She fed them hay, warmed their water, and milked the 2 still willing to stand. It wasn't much, but it would get the cubs through another day. She returned to the cabin to find Cedar on top of the kitchen table, Birch tearing at a pillow, and Juniper nosing the edge of the fireplace again. "You're savages," she declared, hands on hips. "Absolute little devils." But she laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months. They looked up at her with wide eyes and tilted heads, as if confused by the sound. By evening, they were curled together once more, snoring gently. Margaret sat by the fire, sewing up the tear in the pillow when a knock sounded. Her hand froze mid-stitch. "Not again," she muttered. She stood, took the rifle in one hand, and opened the door a crack. But it wasn't Grady. It was Henry, or what remained of him. He was slumped against the doorframe, face white with cold, beard frozen, his coat shredded along one sleeve, and blood dried along his side. "I told you I'd be back before the storm," he rasped, half grinning before sagging forward into her arms. She caught him just barely and dragged him inside, shouting at him through clenched teeth, "You damn fool, what were you thinking?" But he couldn't answer, already slipping into unconsciousness. She laid him on the sofa and worked quickly, cutting away the coat, cleaning the wounds, stitching what she could, feeding him spoonfuls of broth once he was able to swallow. He had a deep gash across his ribs and a twisted ankle. From the look of him, he'd been living off snow and bark for days. When he finally stirred, it was almost dawn again. The cubs approached him cautiously, sniffing, curious. Henry blinked at them, then at Margaret. Are those what I think they are? He asked. She nodded. Their mother's dead. I found her in a trap. And you brought them in, he said, his voice soft but steady. Of course, you did. She braced for judgment, for the lecture she didn't want. But he just smiled faintly and said, You've always had a strange heart, Margaret Holloway. She stared at him a long moment. You're not going to report me? Hell no, he said. After what I've seen, I got no business telling anyone how to survive. Over the next 2 days, Henry regained strength, and with it, the story came out. He'd slipped while crossing a frozen stream and tumbled into a ravine, fracturing his ankle and slicing his side on a jagged rock. He'd crawled inch by inch through the woods, trying to follow the scent of smoke. He'd heard something moving behind him in the dark, thought it was a wolf, but it had never come close. Maybe it was your big bear, he said, watching Margaret from his chair. The one that scared off Grady? She nodded slowly. I think he's still nearby. Henry looked out the window, then at the cubs. Maybe he's waiting for what? For you to finish what you started. The peace didn't last. On the third morning, they heard the crunch of tires on snow. Margaret looked up from her sewing. Henry reached for his coat. Through the frost-covered window, they saw them, Grady, 2 other men, and a state game warden in a dark green jacket. Grady wore a smirk that made Margaret's stomach twist. She stepped outside before they could knock. Whatever you think I've done, I haven't. We know what you've done, Grady snapped. You're harboring wildlife. That's a violation. Dangerous. Irresponsible. Could cost lives. The game warden stepped forward. Ma'am, we've had reports. If you're keeping cubs? She interrupted, their mother was caught in a trap. Bleeding, dying. I did what any decent person would. Grady sneered. You played God. More like you made them dependent. You endangered the town. Endangered them. Margaret said, her voice rising, You're the danger. You, with your traps. The standoff grew thick. Henry stepped outside with his crutch, standing beside her. And she's telling the truth. Those cubs wouldn't have lasted a night, and your trap, Grady, is what started this. But Grady wasn't listening. He pushed forward, brushing past her, his hand on his holster. Move aside, or I'll move you. That's when it happened. A growl, low and thunderous, rolled out from the trees. Everyone froze. From the woods, like before, came the grizzly, not charging, not snarling, just stepping forward with slow, deliberate weight, a sentinel of the forest. His breath steamed in the cold, his eyes locked on Grady, and he kept coming. The warden stepped back. Jesus. Grady reached for his weapon. Don't, Margaret barked. Don't you dare. But Grady raised it, his hand trembling. And then another sound, a softer one, behind Margaret. The cabin door opened, and the cubs stepped out. Cedar first, bold and unafraid. Birch followed. Juniper trailed behind. They didn't run to the bear, they didn't run away. They simply stood there. The bear paused. Something passed between them all, something primal, deep, wordless. Then, just as quietly, the bear turned and walked away, vanishing into the trees like a shadow swallowed by light. No one spoke for a long time. Then the sheriff's voice broke through the silence. Sheriff Collins had arrived quietly, unnoticed, standing at the edge of the trail. I think it's clear where the danger is, and it isn't her. Grady sputtered, but Collins raised a hand. We're calling a vote tonight. The town decides. That evening, bundled in coats and scarves, the townsfolk gathered outside the small church. Margaret stood near the back, the cubs sleeping beside Henry's boots. One by one, people raised their hands, some out of respect, some out of awe, some because they had seen something bigger than laws and boundaries. When it was done, Collins turned to her and said, "You've got your sanctuary. Holloway Ridge is now a protected corridor for them and for you." Margaret looked up at the stars. For the first time in decades, they felt close enough to touch. The snow had begun to melt in thick, dripping sheets, loosening from tree limbs and eaves, turning the silence of winter into the steady sound of falling water. It was the kind of thaw that brought more mud than beauty, but to Margaret Holloway, it felt like rebirth. The days grew longer, the nights softer, and for the first time in months, she no longer feared what might wait outside her door. The cubs had grown quickly. Cedar, now tall enough to put his paws on the table if he stood. Birch, constantly tumbling into barrels and baskets. Juniper, becoming more adventurous, less timid, more herself. They no longer whimpered at thunder or flinched at the wind. They played, they climbed, they explored the edges of the cabin's clearing with the cautious curiosity of wild things, remembering what it meant to be free. And Margaret, for all her aches and old bones, kept up as best she could. She reinforced the back fence so they could wander without slipping into danger. She found new feeding spots along the edge of the woods where they could dig and scratch. She even began reading aloud to them in the evenings, not because they understood the words, but because it filled the silence with something warm. Henry had taken to sitting on the porch each afternoon, one leg stretched stiffly in front of him, sipping coffee and talking to the cubs as though they were neighbors stopping by for a chat. "Cedar's going to be a fighter," he said one morning, watching the cub wrestle a log. "Bet he takes after his dad." Margaret smiled. If it is his dad, who else would come storming out of the trees like that to protect them? Henry asked. "That bear is not just wandering. He's watching." And it was true. They hadn't seen the grizzly up close since the standoff with Grady, but Margaret felt his presence in the woods. Once, she'd caught his silhouette at twilight, high on the ridge, unmoving like a carved statue. Another time, she found fresh tracks by the goat shed, deep, deliberate, but the goats were untouched, as though he was only passing through, watching, waiting. The townsfolk had kept their promise. Holloway Ridge was now marked with wooden signs carved by local hands, "Wildlife Sanctuary." No hunting. No traps. Collins had even arranged for a few Park Service volunteers to hike through monthly and check for signs of poachers. Most of them didn't wander far enough to reach Margaret's cabin, which suited her just fine. She had no interest in tourists or interviews. She hadn't rescued the cubs to be admired for it. She'd done it because something in her had been too tired to let them die, and in saving them, something inside her had come back to life. Still, she knew the day would come when they would need to leave. It began with Cedar. He started refusing the warm milk she brought each morning, sniffing instead at the edge of the forest where deer tracks cut through the brush. Then Birch stopped sleeping inside, curling up beneath the porch instead. Even Juniper began lingering farther and farther away during their afternoon walks. Margaret didn't fight it. She knew better than to hold on too tightly. The wild didn't forgive cages, even those built with love. So she prepared. With Henry's help, she built a wooden gate at the far end of the clearing, nothing more than a symbolic threshold between the cabin and the world beyond. She scattered berries and smoked fish along the tree line to guide them, and on the first truly warm morning of spring, she opened the door and let them go. No ceremony, no speech. Just a quiet goodbye whispered into the wind. The cub stepped out slowly. Cedar, leading, his head high, his ears perked. Birch hesitated only briefly, then followed. Juniper lingered at the edge of the porch, looking back one last time. Margaret knelt and touched her nose gently to Juniper's. "You'll be all right, little one. You have your mother's heart." Juniper pressed into her palm for a moment, then turned and padded after her brothers. Margaret watched them disappear into the trees until the forest swallowed them completely. She stood there a long time, the wind lifting her hair, the sunlight warm on her skin, tears slipping down her face, not from sadness, but from something deeper, acceptance, perhaps, or peace. Henry joined her a while later, limping along with 2 cups of coffee. "You did good," he said, handing her one. "They're strong. They'll make it." She nodded, her throat tight. "They're not the only ones." And days passed, then weeks. The cabin felt quieter than it had in months. Not empty, Margaret had known enough of true emptiness to know this wasn't it, but quieter, like the forest was listening rather than speaking. She fell back into her old rhythms, though they felt different now. The mornings weren't so heavy. The nights not so lonely. Sometimes, she'd catch herself still pouring 3 bowls of food or glancing at the spot near the fire where Juniper used to curl. She let those moments come and go like old songs. One morning, while gathering kindling near the creek bed, she noticed the birds had gone silent. The air changed, still and thick. She stood very still, listening. And then she saw him, the grizzly, the great silent guardian. He stood across the stream, enormous and still as stone, his fur glinting in the sunlight. She didn't move, he didn't move. And then, behind him, she saw 3 shapes, smaller, but no longer cubs, taller now, stronger. Cedar's shoulders were broader, Birch's ears twitched with alertness, and Juniper stepped closest to the water, her eyes locking with Margaret's for a single eternal moment. Margaret didn't call to them, didn't reach out. She only smiled, soft and full and aching, and dipped her head in greeting. The bear watched a moment longer, then turned and led them back into the forest, his massive form disappearing behind a veil of pine needles and shadow. Margaret stood there long after they were gone, hand resting over her heart, the wind swirling gently around her ankles like a blessing. That night, as she and Henry sat on the porch beneath the stars, a soft rustle stirred the brush nearby. A deer passed quietly, an owl called, and the wind carried the scent of pine and something older, wilder. "You ever think," Henry said, sipping his cider, "that maybe you didn't just save them? Maybe they saved you too?" Margaret smiled, gaze fixed on the dark horizon. "No, I don't think it. I know it." They sat in silence for a long time after that, side by side, the warmth of the fire at their backs, the forest before them, vast and alive. And somewhere far beyond the ridge, where the snow still lingered in the deepest shadows, for bears moved through the wilderness, 3 young hearts shaped by love and survival, and one ancient spirit still watching, still guarding. Margaret closed her eyes and listened to the wild speak through the trees. And for the first time in decades, she felt no fear. She had given what she could and received something immeasurable in return, not just peace, not just purpose, but belonging. Spring gave way to summer in a slow unfolding of green and gold. The forest, once brittle with snow and silence, now pulsed with life. Bees traced lazy arcs between wildflowers, streams trickled freely over smooth stones, and birdsong replaced the whisper of the wind. Margaret Holloway moved through it all like part of the landscape, quiet, steady, familiar. She'd taken to walking the ridge each morning, her boots worn thin at the soles, her scarf now more for habit than warmth. Each step on the damp soil was a conversation with the land, and each glance toward the treetops held a silent question. Where are they now? She didn't expect answers, but sometimes the forest gave her one anyway, a bent blade of grass, a scratch on a tree trunk, a print in the mud that was too wide to be anything but bare. She never chased them. She didn't need to. They had moved on, and so had she. Yet she remained tied to them in a way no time could loosen. The sanctuary, now officially recognized by the state, brought a few new visitors to Holloway Ridge: naturalists, quiet hikers, the occasional young ranger with a clipboard and wide eyes. They came with respect, mostly speaking in hushed voices, leaving offerings of apples and berries along the marked trail. Margaret rarely spoke to them beyond a nod or a simple morning. She had no desire to become a local legend or a symbol. She had done what she could, and that was enough. The cubs, no, not cubs anymore, the bears, would write their own stories now, with paw prints and rivers and miles of forest she would never see. Henry had recovered more slowly than the season, but each day brought more color to his face, more strength to his voice. He stayed longer now, splitting his time between his own cabin and Margaret's porch, where they shared long silences and stronger coffee. Sometimes he'd talk about the past, things neither of them had dared mention before: the fire that had taken her family, the accident that left his wife buried under a fallen tree, the choices that had led them both here, to the far edge of everything. There was a comfort in the speaking of it, not for closure but for company. Margaret found that her heart no longer clenched when she remembered her daughter's laughter or her husband's calloused hands. The pain was still there, of course, but it had softened, like a scar smoothed over by time and sunlight. Loss had made room for something else, not joy exactly, but a kind of grounded grace, rooted in the earth beneath her feet and the lives she had helped carry forward. One morning in late June, she awoke to find something different in the air. It wasn't a scent or a sound, not something she could name, just a shift, a sense that the forest was holding its breath. She dressed and then walked without thinking, past the goat shed, across the clearing, through the line of birch trees that had once marked the edge of her world. Her legs carried her to the stream where she had first seen him, the great bear, the sentinel. She stood on the same bank, watching the water tumble over rocks like a silver ribbon, her reflection distorted and dancing on the surface. And then, without a sound, he was there, on the opposite shore, massive and still, just as he had been that first time. His fur was darker now, thicker with age, but his eyes were unchanged, deep, steady, ancient. Margaret didn't move. She didn't need to. The bear blinked slowly, then stepped aside from the trees behind him. Three forms emerged, taller now, broader, their youth shed like old coats: cedar, powerful and proud, a scar tracing one ear; birch, more deliberate, his movements cautious, observant; and juniper, graceful, almost solemn, her eyes locking with Margaret's in that same quiet knowing. They didn't come closer. They didn't need to. It was not a reunion but a witnessing, a moment outside time. They stood there, the five of them, separated by a stream but connected by something much deeper. After a long silence, Juniper made a low, rumbling sound, almost like a sigh, and turned away. The others followed, and the large bear, the guardian, brought up the rear, pausing only once to look back. Margaret nodded. He vanished into the woods. She stayed there long after they had gone, not sad, not longing, just full in a way she hadn't expected. Full of a quiet knowing that they were all right, that they remembered, That she had not been just a chapter in their story but something more enduring, a shape carved into the grain of their lives, just as they had been in hers. That evening, the wind shifted again, a summer breeze this time, rustling the tall grasses and sending waves through the wildflowers. Margaret stood on the porch beside Henry, watching the horizon glow with the final light of day. "They came back," she said simply. Henry didn't ask who. He didn't need to. He reached over and took her hand, their fingers curling together like roots meeting underground. "Then they're safe," he said, "and so are we." She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The moon rose, silver and full, casting a pale light over Holloway Ridge. In the distance, a howl rose from a lone wolf, answered by another, then another, the sounds carrying through the trees like threads of an old song. Margaret listened, not with fear, but with wonder. This place, once so cold and unforgiving, had become a sanctuary, not just for the bears, but for her too. Not a place to hide, but a place to heal, a place where the wild was not something to be tamed, but something to be trusted. She thought about writing a letter, maybe to the state, maybe to no one in particular, something to explain what had happened here. But when she sat at the desk, pen in hand, she found there were no words that could capture it. How do you describe a bear standing watch over your cabin, or the way 3 cubs had curled into your side like children, or the weight of a trap in your hands as you made a choice that changed everything? No, she thought. Some things are not meant to be explained, only lived, only remembered. She folded the blank paper and tucked it into the back of her journal, then stepped outside again, barefoot this time, feeling the earth beneath her toes, the soft pulse of a living world. Fireflies blinked near the edge of the woods. The stars came out, one by one, and somewhere far beyond the trees, for bears moved through the dark, unseen, but not lost. Margaret smiled, closed her eyes, and whispered into the night, "Thank you."